Hi, my name is Jack Fry, and I'm a senior at Santa Clara University studying history and political science. My thesis focuses on presidential elections, more specifically, elections in the modern era. This means any election coming from the end of World War II up until the modern day. Specifically, my thesis looks at four separate election cycles: 1960, which was John F. Kennedy against Richard Nixon; 1980, which was Ronald Reagan against Jimmy Carter; 2004, which was George Bush against John Kerry; and lastly, 2016, which was Donald Trump against Hillary Clinton. In each of these elections, I looked to determine whether policy or personality was a more influential factor in eventually getting that president elected. In terms of methods, I used a lot of the writings of former campaign aides to determine the results of my thesis. This meant I would look towards primary sources written after the elections to see how these aides felt policy and personality contributed towards the success of their candidate. I also wanted to gauge the views of the general public, which means I heavily consult polling and other primary sources around the time, such as newspaper articles, basically detailing the effects of any changes or significant events in each of these election cycles. In order to talk about the results, each election needs to be discussed separately. First, we're talking about 1960, which pitted Richard Nixon against John F. Kennedy. This election was largely decided by character, mainly due because it was the first election in which we had televised presidential debates. During these debates, the candidates were perceived very differently. Despite just a 4-year gap in age, Richard Nixon was perceived to be much more tired and weary than the youthful Kennedy. This was mainly due to the fact that he had been recovering from an infection earlier that week. He was seen to be sweating in the lights of a debate stage. And Kennedy, on the other hand, was much more charismatic. He had this youthful persona that really attracted a lot of people. Interestingly, people say that everyone who watched the debates believed that Kennedy won, where everyone who listened to the debates believed that Nixon won. Immediately following these debates, there was a 3-point shift in polling, which eventually proved determinative to the election. The next election we looked at was 1980, between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. This election was largely determined by policy. This is mainly due to the fact that Jimmy Carter had many crises plaguing his presidency right before the end of his term. So anything coming up to the election is when all these major scandals began to hit. The first one was mainly to do with the increasing price of oil and gas in the US. This was a major burden on consumers in the US as well. Perhaps more significantly, the Iran hostage crisis was also very prevalent during this time. Unfortunately for Carter, the hostages were released on the day of the actual election itself, far too late to make any drastic turnaround and really influence the result. For the Reagan campaign, all they really need to do is consistently draw attention to these perceived policy failures. They made the campaign really all about policy, and character divisions were not stressed as much as they were in previous elections. 2004 was also an election that centered around policy. This was mainly due to the ongoing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Despite the wars decreasing in popularity over the years, especially in the lead up to the 2004 election, George Bush was really able to capitalize on this policy using historical trends. The trends I'm talking about is the fact that no US president that has started a war during their first term has ever lost election during the next subsequent cycle. Bush was very aware of these trends and tried to make the election basically a referendum on this war. Despite the war being unpopular, he was able to use policy to shape his own concerns about character. He portrayed himself as a wartime president. He looked at John Kerry's service in Vietnam, particularly the ads put out by swift boats, to decipher this guy was not someone who was capable of leading the US through a war. In this essence, the historical trends really helped Bush in an election cycle that otherwise would have been very difficult without the effect of the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. The last election we studied had no incumbent and was very much determined by personality. This was an election where neither candidate was overwhelmingly popular. That meant that both candidates routinely turned towards derisive comments against their opponents. Essentially, this election was really the choice between the lesser of two evils, where both candidates were consistently criticizing the other's character, trying to depict them as somewhat worse than they were. So how do we interpret all these results? Well, one trend I really noticed while studying my thesis was that the incumbency proved to be a major factor. In elections where there are incumbents, policy seems to be much more of an influential factor than elections when there are not incumbents. Interestingly, the ways in which policy are used change pretty radically. When a president is doing well, they tend to pride themselves on their achievements. And when they're not doing well, they tend to stress their own character over their policies. On the other hand, challengers, when a president is doing well, will stress character qualifications. When a president is not doing well, they will often look towards their policies. In the conclusion of my thesis, I looked at elections that we did not cover in the main body part of the thesis to confirm the trend and really just get its validity. In the end, I noticed this trend was actually very consistent. Really, what tends to happen when a president is doing well is his policies are emphasized by his own campaign team. When he is not, his policies will be emphasized by the opposite campaign team. On the other hand, when there's no incumbent president, it's really difficult to focus on policy because it's hard to predict what that president will do. In these senses, usually characters used as a tool to define them in in their opponent's view of what their policies will likely be. They use character considerations to point towards this person being a weak candidate and saying that their policies in the future will not reflect what they claim them to be. I hope you enjoyed my video, and that is a short summary of my thesis, which will be available to read in full.